دوستان، اپیزود جدیدی از پادکست شیر یا خط در خدمتتون هستیم. این اپیزود کمی اومدیم تجربه جدید داشته باشیم، به صورت ویدیویی ضبط کردیم و یک مهمان داریم. حالا این اپیزود ما به صورت چون مکالمه و این اینترویویی که داشتیم انگلیسی بوده، به صورت ویدیو و انگلیسی میذاریم و به زودی احتمالاً یه ترجمه از این مکالمه هم به صورت فارسی در پادکست شیر یا خط پخش کنیم. از سلمان جان میخوام که مهمونمون رو معرفی کنن و بعدش میتونیم به این اینترویو گوش بدیم.
مرسی شاهین جان. من از استادم تو مدرسه مطالعات عالی دوبلین یا همون The Global Center for Advanced Studies دعوت کردم که یه بار مهمونمون باشه تو رادیو شیر یا خط. کرستون دیویس استاد فلسفه هست، دانشگاه آکسفورد، دوک و ویرجینیا فلسفه خونده تو آمریکا و کوفاندر و استاد در همین مؤسسه مطالعات جهانی دوبلین هست. ما سعی کردیم که در رابطه با بلاک چین، تمرکز زدایی، تمرکز، اتوماسیون و حالا خیلی از سابجکت های دیگه که در ادامه خواهید شنید نظرات کرستون رو بپرسیم. باز تشکر میکنم از شایان که این فرصت رو به من داد و امیدوارم که لذت ببرین از پادکستی که ضبط کردیم. مرسی شایان.
ممنون سلمان. از همه دعوت میکنم به این اینترویو گوش بدین و به زودی هم ورژن فارسیشو یا با زیرنویس فارسی براتون پخش میکنیم. A short intro about Shir Ya Khat, that translate to head or tails. We started podcast in early 2017. The vision was to open information, similar to what we have for Iran, which another website we have. The goal is to remove the language barrier in order to allow the knowledge of blockchain, cryptocurrencies, and decentralization to be accessible to Farsi-speaking people. And we offer this global open platform to discuss related subjects. I'm really happy that after 3 years, it's still standing and we have more listeners than ever before, even more than the hype of the cryptocurrency prices, because you've seen all the audiences there. And I really like to welcome our guest, Professor Creston Davis, and I'll give the microphone to Salman for some introductory remarks.
Thank you, Shayan. Welcome to Radio Shir Ya Khat. This is Salman, and we are here with Shayan, hosting Professor Creston Davis from the Global Center for Advanced Studies. First of all, let me introduce you our guest today. Professor Creston Davis studied philosophy in University of Virginia and Duke. He is the founder and the director of the Global Center for Advanced Studies and the chancellor and CEO of the Global Center for Advanced Studies College Dublin. Davis was promoted to associate professor at Rolling College and has published several books with the MIT Press, Columbia and Duke University Press. He is the curator and co-edits The Insurrections, Critical Studies in Religion, Politics and Culture series, which is an academic book series published by Columbia University Press. He currently researches future consciousness, sustainability, and advanced technologies. When you think of blockchain, it may seem so strange to imagine a philosopher like the figure of Aristotle or Plato sitting beside the fire day and night, thinking about protocols and rewards. But today we have a philosopher here talking about the blockchain. This is a great honor for me hosting you, Mr. Professor. Thank you for accepting my invitation.
Well, it's a real honor to be part of what you are doing, the podcast. I really appreciate the invitation. Thank you, Salman. Salman, I should mention, for full disclosure, is a master's degree student at GCAS College, Dublin, who is studying philosophy and the blockchain. And so it's really nice to be here. And thank you so much for inviting me. It's a privilege. Thanks.
Thank you. This is a great honor for me to be part of your wonderful praxis. let me start. Adam Greenfield, in his book Radical Technologies, describes blockchain as the first technology that is fundamentally difficult for otherwise intelligent and highly capable people to understand. As all may know, Bitcoin was the first use case of blockchain technology. I, as many, suppose that Bitcoin is an expression of extreme technological libertarianism, the school of thought that you may call anarcho-capitalism or market anarchism. In this philosophy, you distrust the state in favor of individuals, or somehow we can call the sovereignty of individuals in free markets. For an anarcho-capitalist, neither state nor corporations are acceptable intermediaries. So the first question appears here, Mr. Professor. What is the problem with intermediaries and third parties?
Well, great. It's a great question. And I think at this time in history, with these technologies coming to fruition, and by technologies, I mean decentralized ways of organizing ourselves, along with the World Wide Web, you do end up confronting new ways of thinking, new ways to interact with one another. And as a result, new possibilities emerge with these new technologies. And it's always been the case. It's nothing new under the sun. But what is especially interesting here is that when you look at the ways in which intermediaries function, oftentimes you have, whether it's in a ideological structure in capitalism or even in communism, you have these intermediaries. And another way to speak about them would be, a bureaucracy. And, of course, we all want quality. We want to be able to trust one another. But then again, we're highly intelligent individuals need to be able to make decisions on their own without undue influence from intermediaries, such as bureaucracies. And this slows things down, ultimately, the intermediaries. It slows things down. It also, in some respects, when you look at it from a bird's eye point of view, a lot of times in societies where you have really smart people, a few, 1-2% of the population becomes like genius level thinkers, innovators, but not all, of course, genius level thinkers or innovators are courageous. So that even narrows the percentage even more. Bold thinkers who are creative thinkers, but also need to have courage to do what they think is right. And a lot of times you have these intermediaries preventing these geniuses with courage to interact and to implement new technologies or new ways of doing things. And in the end, it's a conformist structure. It arrests creativity. It makes the creative minds shrink and or go into non-existent modes. And as a result, intermediaries have really, I think, been part of a major problem with advancing new technologies, new ways of thinking, new consciousness, new levels of interactions. So for me, although intermediaries can be healthy and good in minimal levels, like namely making sure fraud doesn't happen, but unfortunately, the state apparatus is such a monstrous structure. So what Asimov once said in one of his novels, I can't remember which, the great science sci-fi writer, he wrote, his plot structure was humans have developed this machine that's so complicated, they forgot where the on-off switch was. And I think this is apropos to intermediaries where it's so complex, it's for anything new to happen, it immediately is stifled by the tyranny of bureaucracy. And, when you look at the state apparatus siding decisively with centralized entities, institutions like banks, the Federal Reserve, or like big corporations, like, for example, say Amazon, or Apple or Google, you have the state apparatus side with them over against what's good for society, what's good for innovation, and what's going to advance us beyond some vexing problems that humanity faces. And when the state apparatus decisively sides with the corporate structure, bailing banks out, for example, bailing corporations out, for example, what this does is it puts even more of a burden on the individual in that society across the horizon of society as a whole. And as a result, it undermines and destabilizes new modes of creativity. And again, when that happens, new decentralized formations should be constructed in a way that can advance us beyond the state apparatus.
Thank you, Sharon. Would you please come into the conversation?
Thank you. That was a really interesting. I have to sit through and listen to that again to digest. So one thing you mentioned right before we start recording was about the measures France is taking for the COVID-19 and stuff. I want to link this conversation to the recent events a bit. And we've seen a lot of privacy issues with the measurements that the governments are taking. And I really want to know your opinion about what implicit outcomes would you see that you see from this enforced social distancing and these unprecedented economical measures that we're seeing due to COVID-19. Clearly we're seeing some more out-of-the-box socialist movements from capitalist actors, but are they for the same reasons? Are they sharing the fundamental values that are mainly values, or are they just kicking the can down the road and trying to survive?
Yeah, there's the COVID-19 issue in the pandemic and all the political structure, the post-truth, the media, the conspiracy theories, they run wild. I mean, this is, in fact, a petri dish for perfect scenarios for dystopian structures. And one of the things that's really important for me as a philosopher and people who are dedicated to truth is precisely being able to present truth, to understand and interact with media, with texts, with information, and be able to make decisions based on the accuracy or the falseness of said information. And again, what you have here, especially with the neo-fascist structures and leaders in countries taking hold with isolationism, nationalism, the xenophobia that's going on, and this only exacerbates people with different backgrounds and different ethnicities, and so on. So you have this kind of a perfect storm for distrusting information more and more, and as a result, you fracture the epistemological structure of society, what we as a society can believe in, and what we as a society, as humanity with our minds, can trust or not. And this can only play in the power of those who have access to that power. And that's becoming more and more narrow. Fewer and fewer people have more and more power, whereas the many, the population, has less and less power. And so you have a perfect storm for major problems. I think what's really most dangerous about this situation is how it can be used for power to be concentrated more and more, especially with the militarization of the police force, and so on. So it seems to me that we're in, a pretty tough situation, especially when you consider too, the way we're communicating together now in this podcast is through the World Wide Web. And if you think about who owns the hardware through which the fiber optics, who owns the fiber optics that is literally connecting us right now, it's corporations or it's states. You think if you do something incorrect or in error or something that might be challenging to the ones in power, your access to technologies such as the World Wide Web could easily be canceled. Just like, you have Facebook jail, you have all these policing structures that oftentimes are arbitrary. And so it can be really dangerous, because this is the only way we can connect with one another. And if that connection is severed, then you know, who are you? Or are you even in society? And, you know, as Aristotle once said in the beginning of his book on politics, he says, you know, the ones who live outside society are either, you know, gods or beasts. And, you know, for society to function, you have to be able to trust. And distrust post-truth structures are happening with Fox News, with CNN, you know, even the New York Times, you know, all the major media sources are all playing into these echo fragmentations of epistemological claims. And this becomes deeply problematic, which again gets us back to blockchain in the sense of how do we communicate and what can we trust and distrust. And decentralizing doesn't mean fragmentation. Decentralizing precisely is a way of connecting with other people that can circumvent false claims, conspiracy theories, because precisely you're talking to someone with whom you can check on their background, check their credibility, and therefore trust factors are built into blockchain exchanges, smart contracts, or even education structures like the one that GCAS College has developed. So yeah. How about you? What do you think? Do you think it's what's your take on the virus in Montreal?
Yeah, so that's kind of thing. Like one of the like fundamentals of like democracy is like gossip and social interactions. Like without that, there is no like decentral communication, right? Like it's interesting that like before even this COVID-19, a lot of like future visions were dystopian, and now even a lot of those are happening right now. Like even like walking the street and seeing everyone walking in masks, like that was like, if you go back in 90s movies when they're showing like future dystopia, like that was it. Yeah, it's really scary regarding like the fake news and like media. It's really sad to see like even like I would consider myself an open-minded that like go through the details of like news, and now even if someone with like a PhD degree comes to me and say like this is the vaccine, I would say be like, I'm not sure. How can I verify? And that's a sad part, that there's no easy way to verify this these days, unless you have these role models that you believe in and you can listen to. One of the things that we try to do in Shir Ya Khat podcast is it's kind of follows the radical exchange movement, if you know about that. It's more about like, it says it's not radical to criticize the society, it's radical to come up with solutions. So one of the things we try to do is, now we criticize what is happening now and we almost see what is happening. But as for solutions, to be honest, I'm not sure what the solution is. One thing that we're trying to do is put everything out there, put information out there, point out to scams, fraud, say these are the things, not necessarily name them, just teach people how to identify them. But regarding the news and where to get the news, not to consider like investment and cryptocurrencies, that's a whole different word. Just like truth, I'm not sure these days what can be done.
Yeah, I mean, this is the quintessential question, and it goes all the way back to, you know, civilization, when we start to be able to have to communicate through letters, through distance, and the trust factor has got to be there. And I think this is one of the reasons why, in a way, philosophy, at least in Athens, was so distrusted by the Senate. And this is kind of a famous retelling of this, was by Plato in his Apology, where his teacher, Socrates, the great war hero, and by this time an old man, was considered a big threat to the Athenian city, the polis, because precisely he was teaching students how to think critically and how to question what justice is, for example, and some very basic questions or thematics of existence. And, you know, his very ability to teach young people how to think critically about social organization, about truth claims, was considered a great threat. So, you know, when you put that together with the distrust that's happening here, I mean, it is a good thing, I think, in general, what the Enlightenment taught us, to be skeptical of, you know, apparatuses of power, in the sense that, or at least critical of apparatuses of power, the church, for example, religion, or the state, you know, with the French Revolution, the US Revolution in the 18th century. So in one sense, this is good. It's really good to be critical. The question is, what kind of critical apparatuses or structures or habits does one have? And is it coherent? Is it enough just to criticize? And in fact, I think what philosophy has always tried to do is think through ways of solving, adding to the question of knowledge, rather than simply just criticizing. And, you know, the troll has emerged with the World Wide Web. You know, we're all familiar with the troll. You do blockchain securities, I think. Isn't that right, Shia? Yeah. Yeah, so you're familiar with trolls, with the, you know, vulnerabilities in digital connections, and you know, so I think you're right about the approach should be, how can we offer solutions? And that's one of the things that, you know, when we came up with this idea of a college, the Global Center for Advanced Studies, was not simply to criticize the university structure and the debt that's required for students to go through uni and to have attain degrees, but rather to offer a solution that includes the students with the faculty together, working together in a way that the general goal or mission of the Global Center for Advanced Studies, which I'll call GCAS College, is a working together as a solution in the very process of developing knowledge. So the end of knowledge isn't simply enlightenment for an individual, although it can be that can be an outcome. But here in the structure that we put together in GCAS, the end goal is solidarity with each other and offering a platform through which new innovations can continually be developed. And so it's not simply, oh, it's me with my degree, but rather it's us with new ways of communicating, new ways of developing the human consciousness and solutions.
Yeah, that's great. I'll give the microphone to Salman too, because I know he was excited about asking questions.
Thank you, Shayan. Thank you, Mr. Professor. It is always great to know what the situation we live. I think this is the first time in the history that a German, a Japanese, an Iranian, an old man in South Africa just think about the same problem, to live longer, you know. Yes, we have climate change, global warming, but they refer, I think, to the future. I think this is the first time, and this is great to think about it. Back to intermediaries and our main topics. Bank and financial institutions work as intermediaries in financial capitalism. We are familiar with the idea of exploitation by Marx. You, as a proletariat, work hard and spend less to make some surplus value. You work hard for money, or as Marx said, you were exploited for it, in the sense that you get less than you should. Then you put this surplus value in banks and institutions. Thanks to fractional reserve banking, you get exploited again here. First, it was your labor. Now it is your money. Am I doing well, Mr. Professor? Are they, I mean, financial intermediaries? a secondary exploiter of human labor?
Yeah, I mean, when you look at the shift of how capitalism, and you were quoting Marx there with your intervention of his volume 1 of Capital, about the exploitation of the laborer, and you just give the laborer just enough to keep reproducing themselves, but no more, so they can't grow as individuals. They can't develop new possibilities, new real estate, new different ways of living their life. They're dependent on the owners of the factories, and therefore are enslaved. And I think when you look at the stretch of late capitalism and into neoliberal structures where things are more and more financialized, then you do have major corruptions that start to take place in ways that attempt to enslave the consumer, right? So first, you train the consumer to want and buy more and more and more, and then this becomes a habit. To buy more, you need to go into debt. So you create the debt margin in the 70s with the credit card, and then over time, you spin the consumer into a web of indebtitude that is financial. So it in one sense, it doesn't feel like you're enslaved to the factory or to a conditions of working conditions that might be horrible, although many still face that. But you're indebted in an invisible way, financially, and this invisibility doesn't register with the human consciousness, the brain, in a way that the physical enslavement registers. And yet the dangers are surmounting. If you look at different court cases that have emerged in recent times where people are going to jail for debt, and this can over time be used as a leverage to target specific individuals in society, and it just gives the means of power in an imbalanced way towards those who are in power to be able to leverage that power in more and more ways. So yeah, I agree that the financial indebtitude is very much real. Yes.
And I think banking loans always goes to some people that they don't really need it. I wish everyone read the article wrote by a great British writer, Bernard Russell, in the praise of idleness, if you read. But back to the concept, the fact that you can still look for emancipation of human subject within the market. I mean, by you, those anarcho-capitalists who is still looking for salvation or emancipation of human subject within the market, maybe itself at the center of philosophical debates. What do you think, Mr. Professor? Can we look for salvation within the markets?
I mean, one of the things that the market does is it can, if it was really a free and open market, it can isolate and identify those who are really hard workers, who are clever, who come up with new ways of doing and solving certain situations, and in a way that, say, a communism could never do, because of it would be a threat to the central committee, the centralization. So yeah, I mean, I think that there can be ways that you can understand markets to work in beneficial terms, but too often those terms are hijacked by the few. And so in the name of the ideology of the free market, free and open, unregulated market, it's really a code word for those who are in power, and there are just a few, should be able to continue increasing their power. And that's precisely what we've seen since since neoliberalism began in the 70s, is you have this privatization of public assets, and it's controlled more and more by fewer and fewer people. But this is where I think the promise of why we're meeting here today, and precisely the motif of this podcast, is the heads and tails, is precisely looking at decentralization, looking at potential ways of disrupting intermediaries, disrupting centralization, and connecting with one another across the globe in ways that you can build projects constructively with incentive. I mean, that's the other thing. Humans need incentivization. They're not going to just sit on your fat ass watching The Simpsons all day long. I mean, that's the mode, the general mode of a consumerist culture is precisely a passive mode. Think of the grunge band Nirvana. It smells like Teen Spirit. The main lyric is entertain us, entertain me. I'm a passive subject. I'm only good to receive and to consume, rather than what I think our curiosity as human beings is discover, to break open new horizons and to move forward. Yeah.
That's an interesting point you said about the free markets. Like one of the discussions we had in the previous episodes was about exactly that we've seen in stock markets that there's a lot of regulations, like circuit breakers preventing some stocks like S&P last a while ago to go down more than 7% and all these. And we compare that to cryptocurrency markets, that there is no regulation. It's a bit chaotic, exactly a roller coaster. And we were discussing which one is more closer to the definition of free markets. There is still manipulation in that, but isn't that manipulation a part of free market or not? That was one of the discussions. Yeah.
Wow, that's a good question. And I'm no economist, so I'm my answer can only be really amateur at best. But yeah, I mean, when you look at like the Bitcoin market, its fluctuation, but then you map it onto the recent oil market, and you're thinking, wow, the oil market's fluctuating dramatically, and therefore the fluctuation itself reflects like the value of that market itself. And in fact, I think one could argue that the more fluctuation a market has, its potential value, I think, can be seen as enhanced in some way. Okay, sure, you can't predict it, but isn't that precisely what interesting markets do? It's the roll of the dice. It's the whole thing of risk. And this, you hear the capitalist ideologies or the ideologue talking about, yeah, we need risk, and rather than the government backing us all up. But look what's happened with the government constantly bailing out the banks, constantly bailing out the corporate world. So I got myself away from the answering your question about the fluctuation of markets, but I do think there is a kind of there can be a manipulation by, think about what Soros did in the early 90s into the British stock market, and he almost sank it, as I understand it. So there are actors who can manipulate things, like the Republican congressman who pulled out of their investments a couple of days before the markets fell, and having some inside information, but so I think you're always going to have manipulation. And I guess always the question is going to constantly be, to what degree can you have a certain form of regulation that allows for the maximization of risk, the maximization of profits, of gain, but without it being deregulated, in which case it becomes mafia. It becomes just 3 or 4 actors at the end can manipulate massively. So where is the balance between regulating things and the pure, free, unregulated, manipulative, mafioso market?
Yeah, exactly. Like one of the examples is like short selling, that it's not possible for most people to do, and short selling is basically going against a stock or some investment, and you have to like have some degree of like credibility or like investment portfolio to be able to do that, and that goes against the free market.
Absolutely. Another example or anecdote to that effect is, it used to be the case when you started a startup, only people who could invest in it, because it's not a public, it's not an IPO, it's a private company, and the only people who could really invest were accredited investors. Now that's since been relaxed recently in the past couple of years, where you can have people who Joe, any average guy invest in a company that's not your friend or family. Okay, again, you have possibilities of scams and frauds. They always will exist. But at the same time, having the ability to crowdfund a startup is also, I think, a really good move forward.
Thank you. Salman, you can continue if you want.
Thank you, Shayan. Mr. Davis, I think you just mentioned that this is what I get from your speech about market, that every economy is libidinal. Or am I right? Or what do you think?
Are you referring to Lyotard's notion of the libidinal economy?
This is, yes, but the most problem of the idea of Lyotard, I think, is the distinction between these two facts, these two axioms. We should suppose that every economy is libidinal, or every libido is economy. And I think you mentioned that every economy is libidinal. Am I right? Am I get right?
Yeah, I mean, that's where I would go with that. Although, of course, Lyotard was mostly a literary philosopher of the literature, a literary horizon. But there's something to that. And in fact, there's something to notions that come out of psychoanalysis that can diagnose or help us understand better notions of markets, from death drive to risk factors, and to how we think and consciously process risk versus security. Yeah, for sure.
I know that you're interested in psychoanalysis, and you're a professional philosopher in psychoanalysis, and this is the most interesting part of this conversation. This would be, I think, but excuse me, I should back to my imagining the end of both nation states and corporations is even, I think, harder than imagining the end of capitalism itself. This would be the other side, or the dark side, of the blockchain technology. Blockchain could further consolidate the centralized power of corporation and governments. Every Wall Street bank is doing blockchain project. Data shows that only two Chinese giants can control half of the Bitcoin mining operations. Also, smart contracts, which are among the best use cases of blockchain technology, would be very beneficial in terms that they would cut off the power of middlemen and intermediaries. There are some other problems with them. The emerging of highly automated society may cause some changes in the future of job market. I'm talking about the threat of automation and job loss in the coming years. A new kind of job loss that is totally different from the one that human experienced during the 20th century. In 20th century, lots of unemployed farm workers, due to automation in agriculture, moved to working in industries. So people lost their low-skill jobs in farms and transferred to low-skill jobs in industries. There were still some opportunities for masses, because the owners of the means of production need their work power. But today, for most of those masses, it is not easy to make the transition. No one knows what the job market would be like in 30 or 40 years. Especially, it is not the problem of United States or Western Europe, but in undeveloped countries, like countries in Africa or Central Asia, governments have no idea what to teach children in school. A new kind of, I think, a new kind of inequality will emerge here due to contradiction between the owners of data, I mean Facebook, Twitter, and etc., and a new sort of class. That's why, as you all know, Harari would call useless class. So, what is your idea, Mr. Professor? How would you describe this inequality? And do you see blockchain a game changer, a narrative technology here?
Wow, that's a really good question, and it would take a book to really respond. But I really, I really like I like your question.
All is yours. You can talk as a whole book. Yeah.
Well, I mean, I do have some ideas. You know, we are familiar with AI technologies, automation. You know, I first learned about this when I was an undergraduate in Oxford when I read Jeremy Rifkin's book called The End of Work, and it really read like a sci-fi diagnostic of the economy. Like, really, are there really going to be machines that take over jobs? And this was in the early 90s when I was going and reading this. But as it turns out that more and more, it's the case that two things have happened. You know, jobs are shipped over for cheaper labor markets overseas from, say, first world to developing world to save money on labor costs. What happens there? You have sweatshops, you know, in Bangladesh, for example, which is where all the T-shirts in many of the major stores that we wear are made in sweatshops. So you then just have this. So that's the first part, is you have shipping overseas or outsourcing jobs. And then you can pay less, and the conditions are really bad and even worse for human beings to make consumer items. China is a good example of being able to make a lot of products for cheap, and the US loves to consume it, to consume those products. So that's the first one. The second one is automation. So it's a double-edged sword, or it's a double whammy, let's say. In the first place, let's ship jobs overseas to save money on labor. And with the money we're saving on the labor costs, we're going to invest in AI, or artificial intelligence, automating machines in the United States. And this is precisely what's happened. And now with COVID, with the pandemic, with everybody in isolation, this is a perfect example or laboratory in which to measure who is really essential for an economy and who is not. And this is an answer to a question that you could only theorize about. But now you can actually have data, who's really essential to an economy and who's not. And my guess is you're going to have basically a massive push for AI technologies happening in the United States, in Canada, in developing worlds, in Europe, Western Europe. And you're going to be able to displace workers altogether. And this we call the lumpkin proletariat, right? The ones who have no means of being able to survive on their own anymore. And what is this going to be? And no wonder you see the ramping up of militarization of police forces. No wonder you have this rather artificial way to separate immigrants from the fortress Europe, from Trump's wall. And this, when you put these logics together, that double whammy, outsourcing AI, and you have massive unemployment with walls going up and the militarization of the police and the state apparatus, it doesn't look very rosy. It looks really ominous. And so my answer to this, because we can't just sit around twiddling our thumbs or entertaining ourselves by talking about how dystopian everything is, which becomes a certain kind of enjoyment, a pleasure in basking in our demise as a civilization. So my answer was, let's develop a college that is also a venture firm that can create jobs for people while they do their degrees, while they finish their degrees, and you create a federation of individuals across the planet who are able to trust each other and can therefore develop new and interesting ways of making things, making society at the level of a virtual and actual axis point or vortex. And so rather than just sitting on my ass or retiring as a professor, which I certainly could have done, I decided let's try to strategize here, knowing what's really happening. So that's my contribution, along with the others in GCAS, including you, Salman. That's what we're doing. We're developing those platforms So yeah, and our cryptocurrency, as you know, it's very different than the Bitcoin cryptocurrency. You can earn cryptocurrency from within the developing community, the college, and then be able to start paying for books and classes, but also eventually with our store launching in e-commerce, you're going to be able to pay for food, for other supplies, smartphones, computers, whatever. You're going to be able to pay potentially utilities, so that you can create an internal economy that grows itself through itself as an immanent structure in a kind of Deleuzian philosophical sense. Although, so that's my contribution as best as I can make it.
As you mentioned, Deleuze, I want to say that can we call universities meta-narratives that, for example, GCAS or other new kind of institutions should go against this kind of, as a postmodernistic act, go against these meta-narratives? That was my last question about your wonderful praxis, as I'm previously engaged. But I don't know if you want to end the conversation with the describing of GCAS, or Shayan, what do you think? Would you please come in, Shayan?
I have a question regarding globalization of value that you mentioned something there, and I have this. So a quick background, next week there is this conference called DeFi Discussions, Decentral Finance Discussions, and I'll be there in a panel with someone from Cuba and someone from Venezuela, and talking about how Bitcoin moves value in and out of closed economies. So we had some talks with them before, and it's interesting that we realized that the Western view of authoritarian government is this one cliche top-down hierarchy. But it's not the case. Usually it's not the case. And even if it's different in these three different countries and places, we really wanted to have someone from North Korea too, but they have some technical issues there. So I really want to know your opinion about this. Where do you see the closed economies fall in the globalization? And is there any questions or points that you want to see discussed in that panel?
Yeah, wow, that's a great question. Thank you. And good luck with that conference. It sounds really amazing. Is that in Montreal, that conference?
Everything's online these days.
Oh, you're right. Okay. Yeah. It doesn't exist any physical space. But
yeah, exactly.
But no, I mean, again, I'm not an economist, so I have a hard time maybe understanding notions of closed economies, although I can guess, with Venezuela, Cuba as a kind of quasi-closed economy. Of course, anytime you have closed economies like Cuba, no doubt other economies are parasitical on them. So they're not totally closed, but yeah, I get your point. There's embargoes like Iran, for example, and so on. So, but wouldn't it be incredible if a cryptocurrency of some kind, Bitcoin, maybe, I'm very critical of Bitcoin for ecological reasons, but wouldn't it be incredible if there would be digital assets in a way that could permeate and pop holes in the closure of said economies in ways that can start to open up value structures for individuals, coding to, poetry to art, and all these various ways that we can possibly open up new forms of value. It's the Nietzschean, who is a philosopher, German philosopher, Friedrich Nietzsche, about 100 years ago or 120 years ago, in which he, was trying to think through what it would be like to reevaluate the notion of value itself. And I think we stand at a crossroads with decentralized technologies as being able to think through that very question, maybe even go further with it. What is it that shapes notions of value? What are notions of desire when you have a foreclosure to a consumerist economy? I think that's going to be over. The days of consuming and debt are going to dry up, especially with, and this is going to be the meta narrative of the central state. The bailing outs are all going to be used against the people. We bailed out, and therefore our deficit is even greater. And because of the deficit being more and more, they're going to use that as an excuse to implement ominous forms of control. And why stand by and trust the government? It's never, like, if you think about it, the government, and with very few exceptions, it never really sides with the people. It has never done that. The kings and queens before the nation state developed in Western Europe in the 15th, 16th century. And it's interesting when you think through the history of the birth of the nation state and therefore economies. You have the birth of the corporation, the East Indies Corporation, 1609. West Indies Corporation that founded the city of New York on fur trade. And so what I think we're starting to see here is a kind of fragmentation with the drying up of the consumer. And, of course, there's this attempt to push back with the socialist agenda with Bernie Sanders, with Corbyn in Britain, to some, although much less degree, the president of Canada. But, in the end of the day, either you're going to have a massive uprising, and that doesn't, psychologically speaking, when you just calculate the psychology and the history of psychology from the 70s until today, the psychology in the 60s was ripe for taking the control of the means of production, because it was cheaper to live. You could live in a car, you could live on $1 a week. Nowadays, in terms of the expenses of living, you're not going to have that ability to protest for long, extended periods of time and at the same time eat. So it's a humanitarian crisis. Furthermore, the psychology of protest, what does that mean and how can you persist? Sure, it's okay to occupy Wall Street for a couple weeks, but then again, you see the failure of the Occupy movement. It didn't have a demand. It didn't have an agenda. It couldn't sustain itself over a long period of time. So when we developed GCAS as an idea, I was speaking with a former president of ours, Alain Badiou, the famous French philosopher. The question becomes, how do you maintain the ability to reproduce yourself over a long period of time, over a generation or two? And that's where you start to build a psychology that's different when you can maintain the conditions of your own autonomy. And so that was how we built GCAS, is being able to keep sustaining ourselves over a long period of time. And this can become a catalyst for sustained protest, because now you have means of production that can maintain itself and reproduce itself in order to carry on a sustained form of social solidarity.
That was a really interesting answer. One thing I want to add to that, also like link back to Salman's question about data silos. One thing that we notice is like necessarily these closed economies, because of sanctions, they're not all just monetary values. You could see like information as a source of value. And one thing we've seen, like with Slack, GitHub, just like banning users that has ever logged in Iran, we've seen like some companies do over compliance, meaning that they are using, let's say, Google services for their servers. Google has this engineer that's for some reason blocked traffic to Iran, Cuba, and some other countries. And even though this company explicitly is not blocking anyone in Iran, their websites are not accessible because of the stack or technology they're using. And it goes back to your topic that like a lot of decentralized technologies can help with these, but they need to be scalable. Like right now, they're not there yet. It's less than 10 years old. Like most of them are less than 10 years old. Bitcoin is the longest one, which is still not scalable. And we are seeing more of this. And I really want to know more about where we can read about more the GCAS and how someone can participate in this.
Yeah, well, thank you so much. It's really been a great conversation. I appreciate it. And, again, I ventured to speak about topics like economics in ways that an amateur does. But so forgive me about that and my lack of knowledge on those levels. But yeah, I mean, GCAS is a project that sees these trends happening in the globe, starting with higher education, with debt, with how labor is being organized, how militarization is happening. And so we created a context in which we could continue reproducing ourselves as a mode of production in the knowledge exchange, but also in startup ideas that have traction, and then get behind those startup ideas and then have ownership stake. And that's where the venture side of GCAS comes in those startups. So we help them start up with some funding. They are successful or not. If they're successful, everybody benefits, because everyone who graduates from GCAS college becomes an owner of GCAS college. So we give them a diploma, and rather than having banks send them payments, we give them a diploma and stock certificates that is equal to the investment that the student has put in for tuition. And so for us, it's a collaborative P2P, and by P2P, you know this, but by P2P, you mean peer-to-peer cooperation. So it's horizontal, and the more horizontal things can be, the stronger they get, quicker. And you talk about that scaling. Scaling can happen in P2P networks much faster than top-down networks. Like one person owns and it's in control of 100 different sub people. Right, so P2P is a structure that works faster, but it doesn't work. P2P doesn't work perfectly. You still need ethos. You still need a culture. You still need a language. You still need the ability to trust one another and build that trust. So, but you can read about us on our website. It's gcas.ie, because it's in Ireland.ie. You can look up GCAS or gcas.io. And we have different nodes, 8 nodes around the world. We're about to launch another one in Asia here shortly. And, sort of being able to decentralize education and grow knowledge platforms. And therefore, getting back to the notion of value, the reevaluation of value. Think about all the time we have on our hands. When we like something on Facebook, you're not getting assets for that. And we're developing new ways to, let's say, give assets for time that you would spend doing various things, liking things, and sharing information. So let's see how it goes. So far, so good. We have a fintech and a Finnish investor who's on board with us, and he's. So we're doing really well, and I really appreciate the time and the interest. And if anybody's interested in taking classes and doing a degree with us, by all means, check us out. Thanks.
I really appreciate everyone's time here, especially Professor Creston Davis. It was a fascinating discussion, and I hope that we can have another session in the near future to get more in depth of these subjects, because we touched some of the aspects, and we can just dissect economy together here. Thank you, and stay safe and 2 meters apart.
Yeah, no kidding, right? Thank you so much. It's really a pleasure to meet you. Good luck in Montreal, and Salman in Iran. It's a real pleasure to get to know you and to work with you on an intellectual level. Thank you.
Thank you.